I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I thought I understood manipulation, deception, the way people could twist your heart until you couldn't tell love from lies anymore. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered that night in Bangkok when I walked into that dimly lit theater and saw 10 other men sitting in the front row, each clutching the same handwritten invitation I held in my trembling fingers, each believing, just like me, that they were the only one, that they were special, that Shalita had chosen them. My name is Mark Stevenson, and I'm about to tell you the most humiliating, devastating, and ultimately transformative story of my life. A story about how a 53-year-old divorced engineer from Manchester could fall so completely, so utterly, for a scheme so perfectly orchestrated that even now, 2 years later, I sometimes wake up wondering if it was all just an elaborate nightmare. But before we dive into this rabbit hole of deception and heartbreak, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story, it's a warning, a lesson, and maybe, just maybe, it could save you from making the same catastrophic mistakes I made. Subscribe because stories like this need to be told, need to be heard, and need to be remembered. The invitation was written on cream-colored paper, the kind you'd use for wedding announcements or important business correspondence. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, unmistakably feminine. "My dearest Mark," it began, "you have captured my heart in ways I never thought possible. I would be honored if you would attend my special dance performance this Friday evening at 8 o'clock. This performance is deeply personal to me, and I want to share this vulnerable moment with the man who means everything to me. With all my love, Chalita." I must have read that invitation 100 times in the days leading up to that Friday. I carried it in my jacket pocket, unfolding it during lunch breaks, tracing the curves of her letters with my fingertip like some lovesick teenager. At 53, after 22 years of marriage that ended in bitter divorce proceedings and lonely nights in a studio apartment that smelled like instant coffee and regret, I thought those days were behind me. I thought I was too old, too damaged, too cynical to fall in love again. But Chalita changed everything. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the man I was before I met her. Picture this: Mark Stevenson, civil engineer, father of 2 grown children who barely returned my phone calls, ex-husband to a woman who took half my assets and all of my self-respect. I was the kind of man who ate the same sandwich for lunch every day, who watched the same news programs every evening, who had given up on the idea that life held any more surprises for me. The divorce had been finalized for 18 months when my company sent me to Bangkok for a 3-month project overseeing the construction of a new commercial complex. I didn't want to go. I'd never been to Asia, spoke no Thai, and frankly, the thought of being alone in a foreign country where I couldn't even read the street signs terrified me. But the alternative was redundancy, and at my age, in my field, redundancy was a death sentence. So there I was, Mark Stevenson, sitting in a cramped economy seat on a 15-hour flight to Bangkok, reading the same engineering manual I'd been carrying around for years, trying not to think about how empty my life had become. I remember looking out the airplane window as we descended into Don Mueang Airport, seeing the sprawling city lights below, and feeling nothing but a profound sense of displacement. This wasn't my world. These weren't my people. This wasn't my life. The first few weeks in Bangkok were exactly as miserable as I'd expected. The heat was oppressive, a thick blanket of humidity that clung to my skin from the moment I stepped outside my air-conditioned hotel room. The food was too spicy, the traffic was chaotic, and every conversation was a struggle between my limited English-Thai phrasebook and the patient but exhausted expressions of people trying to help me navigate their city. I threw myself into work with the kind of desperate intensity that only comes from having nothing else to live for. 12-hour days became 14-hour days. I ate room service dinners alone while reviewing blueprints. I called my kids every Sunday, but our conversations were stilted, awkward, filled with long pauses and the unspoken acknowledgement that we'd become strangers to each other. But loneliness has a way of wearing you down, of making you do things you never thought you would do, which is how I found myself on a humid Thursday evening in my 6th week in Bangkok, standing outside a karaoke lounge called Golden Dragon, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and music filtering through the heavy wooden doors. I'd walked past this place dozens of times on my way back to the hotel. It was tucked between a street food vendor and a shop selling knockoff designer handbags, the kind of place I would never have entered back home in Manchester. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting pink and blue shadows on the narrow sidewalk, and there was something about the warm light spilling from the windows that made it look welcoming, inviting, alive in a way that my sterile hotel room definitely wasn't. That night, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I pushed open those heavy doors and stepped inside. The Golden Dragon was smaller than I'd expected, with red velvet wallpaper and gold-framed mirrors that made the space feel both intimate and slightly surreal. There were maybe a dozen small tables scattered around a tiny stage where a middle-aged Thai man was enthusiastically butchering My Way by Frank Sinatra. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sweet smell of Thai whiskey, and for a moment I considered turning around and walking right back out. But then I saw her. Chalita was sitting alone at a corner table, nursing what looked like a gin and tonic, her long black hair falling like a curtain over one shoulder. She was wearing a simple white blouse and dark jeans, nothing fancy, nothing that should have made her stand out in a room full of people. But there was something about the way she held herself, the way she listened to the terrible karaoke performance with what seemed like genuine interest, that caught my attention immediately. She looked up just as I was staring, and our eyes met across the smoky room. She smiled, not the practiced professional smile I'd grown accustomed to from hotel staff and taxi drivers, but something warmer, more genuine, something that made my heart skip in a way I thought it had forgotten how to do. I ordered a beer from the bar, telling myself I'd drink it quickly and leave, but I kept glancing over at her table and she kept glancing back. When the karaoke singer finally finished his massacre of Sinatra and left the stage, she stood up and walked over to where I was sitting. "You look like a man who's far from home," she said in accented but perfectly clear English, her voice soft and melodious with just a hint of something I couldn't quite place, sadness maybe, or longing. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, gesturing to my wrinkled business shirt and the tourist guidebook I'd forgotten was sitting on the table beside my beer. She laughed, and it was such a genuine, delightful sound that I felt something inside my chest unclench for the first time in months. "May I sit?" she asked, and when I nodded, she slid into the chair across from me with a grace that made every movement look like part of a carefully choreographed dance. "I'm Chalita," she said, extending her hand. Her fingers were long and elegant, with nails painted a deep burgundy that matched her lipstick. "Mark," I replied, shaking her hand and feeling a jolt of electricity at the contact. "Mark Stevenson." "What brings you to Bangkok, Mark Stevenson?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. I found myself telling her everything, about the construction project, about the divorce, about how foreign and isolated I felt in this beautiful, overwhelming city. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, not my children, not my friends back home, not even my therapist during those mandatory counseling sessions the divorce lawyer had recommended. Chalita listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't experienced in years. She asked thoughtful questions, made sympathetic sounds at the right moments, and when I finally stopped talking, realizing I'd been rambling for nearly an hour, she reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "You seem like a good man who's been through something difficult," she said softly. "I understand that feeling." She told me about herself, painting a picture of a life that seemed both exotic and tragically familiar. She was 28 years old, originally from a small village in northern Thailand, but had been living in Bangkok for several years. She worked part-time as a translator for tourist groups, she said, which explained her excellent English. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was in her early 20s, and she had no siblings, no extended family to speak of. Like me, she was alone in the world, trying to make sense of a life that hadn't turned out the way she'd planned. "I come here sometimes," she said, gesturing around the karaoke lounge. when the loneliness gets too heavy. There's something about being around people, even strangers, that makes it easier to bear. I understood exactly what she meant. We talked until the Golden Dragon closed at 2 in the morning. We talked about books and movies, about travel and dreams, about the strange way life could surprise you when you least expected it. By the time the lights came up and the staff started stacking chairs on tables, I felt more connected to another human being than I had in years. "I should go," she said, gathering her small purse and light jacket. "But I'm very glad we met tonight, Mark Stevenson." "Would you—" I started, then stopped, suddenly feeling foolish. "Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night? I mean, if you're not busy." She smiled that same warm, genuine smile that had first caught my attention. "I would like that very much." We exchanged phone numbers, and as I watched her disappear into the Bangkok night, I felt something I hadn't felt since my marriage fell apart: hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, life still had something good in store for me. I should have known then that hope in the wrong hands can be the most dangerous weapon of all. The next evening, Shalita met me at a small Thai restaurant she'd recommended, tucked away in a narrow alley that I never would have found on my own. She was wearing a flowing sundress that complemented her skin tone perfectly, her hair pulled back in a way that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. When she smiled and waved from the table by the window, I felt that same flutter of excitement I'd experienced as a teenager on my first real date. Dinner was perfect in every way. The food was incredible. Dishes I'd never heard of that she ordered for us, explaining each one with the enthusiasm of someone sharing her culture with a friend. The conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from light topics to deeper ones with the natural rhythm of two people genuinely interested in each other. She asked about my children, and when I admitted how distant our relationships had become, she squeezed my hand across the table and said, "Sometimes, the people we love need time to remember why they loved us in the first place." After dinner, we walked through the busy streets of Bangkok, the city coming alive around us with an energy that felt almost electric. Street vendors called out their wares, tuk-tuks buzzed past like oversized beetles, and the air was filled with a mixture of exhaust fumes, cooking food, and flowers from the numerous shrines scattered throughout the city. "Do you know what I love most about Bangkok?" Chalita asked as we paused at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. "What's that?" "It's a city where anyone can become someone new," she said, her eyes reflecting the neon lights around us. "Where the past doesn't have to define who you are today." I thought about that statement a lot in the weeks that followed. At the time, it seemed profound, hopeful, almost poetic. Later, I would understand it as something else entirely. We began seeing each other regularly. What started as dinner twice a week quickly became every other evening, then daily phone calls, then text messages throughout the day that made me smile during the most mundane moments of my work routine. Shalita had a way of making everything feel more vibrant, more meaningful. The Bangkok that had seemed so foreign and overwhelming began to feel like home when I was with her. She showed me parts of the city tourists never see. We visited small temples where elderly monks blessed us with whispered prayers and drops of holy water. We explored weekend markets where the air was thick with the smell of grilled meat and exotic fruits I'd never tasted. She taught me basic Thai phrases, laughing gently when I mispronounced the tonal inflections that seemed to come so naturally to her. "Your accent is getting better," she would say, even though I knew it wasn't true. But the way she said it, with such genuine affection, made me want to keep trying. I started changing my work schedule to spend more time with her. I declined dinner invitations from colleagues, postponed weekend site inspections, anything to maximize our time together. My life, which had been so structured and predictable, began to revolve entirely around Shalita's availability, her moods, her needs. She never directly asked for money, but there were hints, subtle suggestions that painted a picture of financial struggle. She mentioned being behind on rent for her small apartment. She talked about needing dental work that she couldn't afford. She once showed up to one of our dates with a bandaged hand, explaining that she'd injured it at her translation job but couldn't afford to see a doctor. Of course I helped. How could I not? When someone you care about is in pain, when someone who brings such joy to your life is struggling, you do what you can. I paid her rent for 2 months, covered the dental work, insisted on taking her to a private clinic for her hand injury. Each time she protested, claimed she couldn't accept my generosity, but eventually allowed me to convince her that it was what I wanted to do. "You're too kind to me, Mark," she would say, her eyes filling with tears that I now realize were perfectly timed, perfectly placed. "I don't deserve someone like you." The first real warning sign came about 2 months into our relationship. I had finished work early and decided to surprise her with lunch, so I took a taxi to the area where she'd told me she lived. I'd never been to her apartment. She always claimed it was too small, too embarrassing to have guests, but I had the general address from when I'd helped with her rent. I was walking down the street looking for building numbers and trying to match them to the address she'd given me when I saw her coming out of a high-end shopping mall, carrying several designer shopping bags and laughing with a well-dressed Thai woman I'd never seen before. She was wearing clothes I'd never seen before, too. An expensive-looking dress, jewelry that caught the sunlight in ways that suggested it wasn't costume pieces. For a moment, I considered calling out to her, but something held me back. Instead, I ducked into a nearby coffee shop and watched through the window as she and her companion climbed into a taxi. The shopping bags alone probably cost more than I'd been giving her for monthly expenses. That evening, when we met for dinner, I mentioned casually that I'd been in her neighborhood earlier in the day. "Oh, I wasn't there today," she said without missing a beat. "I had to work a double shift with a tour group visiting the Grand Palace. Very demanding German tourists," she added with a tired smile. "I'm exhausted." She was lying. I knew she was lying. But instead of confronting her, I found myself making excuses. Maybe I'd been mistaken. Maybe it had been someone who looked like her. Maybe she'd forgotten about a quick shopping trip between tour groups. Love has a way of making you rationalize things that should be red flags, of turning obvious deceptions into minor misunderstandings. The second warning sign came a few weeks later. Shalita had been talking more and more about her passion for traditional Thai dance, how she'd trained since childhood, how it was the one thing that truly made her feel alive. She showed me photos on her phone of herself in elaborate costumes, her body frozen in graceful poses that seemed to defy gravity. "I used to perform professionally," she told me one evening as we sat on the balcony of my hotel room, the Bangkok skyline stretched out before us like a circuit board of lights. But the money was never enough to live on. That's why I started doing translation work instead. She seemed sad when she talked about giving up dance, and I found myself wishing I could do something to help her reconnect with that passion. So when she mentioned, almost casually, that there was an opportunity for her to perform at a small cultural center, nothing big, just a chance to get back on stage, I immediately offered to help with whatever she might need. "It's not about money," she said quickly. "It's just, the costume rental is expensive and I would need to miss some translation work to rehearse properly." Of course I offered to cover the costs. Of course I insisted. The amount she mentioned, equivalent to about £800, seemed reasonable for what she was describing. More than reasonable, actually, for the chance to see her perform something she was so passionate about. But then she made a request that should have stopped me cold. "I want this to be special, Mark. Personal, just between us. I don't want other people there judging, watching. Would you mind if it was a private performance, just for you?" The way she asked, the vulnerability in her voice, the way she looked at me like I was the most important person in her world. How could I say no? Of course I wanted a private performance. Of course I wanted to be the only one there, the only one who got to see this intimate side of her artistry. We set a date 3 weeks away. She needed time to rehearse, she said, to make sure everything was perfect. In the meantime, our relationship seemed to deepen even further. She stayed overnight at my hotel room more frequently. She talked about the future, about what might happen when my project in Bangkok ended, about the possibility of her visiting me in Manchester. "I've never been to England," she said one morning as we lay in bed, the Bangkok sun filtering through the hotel room curtains. "I imagine it's very different from here." Very different, I agreed. Colder, rainier, but there are beautiful parts too. I'd love to show them to you someday. She curled closer to me, her head on my chest, her hair spilling across my shoulder like silk. Do you think, do you think we could have a life together? After all this? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and hope. At that moment, lying there with her warm body pressed against mine, the idea seemed not just possible but inevitable. Of course we could have a life together. Of course this was leading somewhere permanent, something real. Yes, I said, kissing the top of her head. I think we could. I should have wondered why she never talked about the logistics, how she would get a visa to England, what kind of work she might do there, whether she had other ties, other relationships, other obligations that might complicate such a dramatic life change. But I was too caught up in the fantasy, too desperate for the story to be true, to ask the hard questions. The week before her performance, Chalita seemed nervous, distracted. She would drift off in the middle of conversations, checking her phone constantly, making excuses to leave early from our dinner dates. "I'm sorry," she would say. "I'm just so focused on getting the dance perfect for you." I want it to be something you'll never forget. And it was. It was definitely something I would never forget. The venue she'd chosen was a small theater in an arts district I wasn't familiar with. She gave me specific instructions: arrive at 8 o'clock sharp, enter through the side door, take a seat in the front row. She would already be backstage preparing, and she didn't want to see me beforehand because it would make her too nervous. I arrived 15 minutes early, eager and excited, carrying a bouquet of orchids I'd bought from a flower seller outside my hotel. The side door was propped open and I could hear soft music drifting from inside. I followed a dimly lit hallway past what looked like dressing rooms and storage areas until I reached the main theater. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 50 seats total, with red velvet chairs arranged in neat rows facing a simple stage. The lighting was warm and intimate, perfect for the kind of personal performance Chalita had described. I made my way to the front row, chose a seat in the center, and settled in to wait. At exactly 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see other people entering the theater. A man in his 60s, well-dressed, carrying a bouquet of roses. Another man, maybe my age, also with flowers. Then another and another. By the time the lights dimmed, there were 11 of us in the front row. 11 middle-aged men, all carrying flowers, all sitting with the same expectant expression I imagined was on my own face. That's when I realized I wasn't special. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one. That's when my heart started to understand what my brain was still refusing to accept. The curtain rose and there was Chalita, beautiful and graceful in an elaborate traditional costume that must have cost far more than the 800 pounds I'd contributed. She began to dance, her movements fluid and hypnotic, her expressions serene and focused, but I wasn't watching the dance anymore. I was watching the faces of the other men in the front row, seeing my own emotions reflected back at me in their expressions of adoration and wonder. I was noticing how she made eye contact with each of us at different moments during the performance, how she seemed to be dancing specifically for each man individually, how her smile appeared to be meant for each of us alone. When the dance ended and the lights came up, Chalita bowed gracefully and gestured for us to join her backstage. I followed the group numbly, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. Backstage, she greeted each of us warmly, individually, as if we were meeting by coincidence. To the older gentleman, "Robert, what a wonderful surprise to see you here." To the man my age, "David, I didn't know you were interested in Thai dance." To me, "Mark, darling, I'm so glad you could make it." Each of us, I realized, was being treated like we'd stumbled upon her performance by accident. Each of us was being made to feel like we were the one she was really happy to see, the one who mattered most. I want to tell you that I confronted her right there, demanded an explanation, called her out on the deception that was becoming increasingly clear. But I didn't. I was too shocked, too embarrassed, too desperate to believe that there was some reasonable explanation for what I was witnessing. Instead, I made small talk with the other men, learned that Robert was a retired businessman from Australia, that David was a divorced architect from Germany, that there was a software engineer from Canada, a doctor from New Zealand, a teacher from the United States. All of us foreigners, all of us middle-aged, all of us clearly smitten with Chalida in the same way I was, and all of us, I began to suspect, being played in exactly the same way. I waited until the group began to disperse before approaching her privately. She was removing her stage makeup in a small mirror backstage, and when she saw me in the reflection, she smiled that same warm smile that had first caught my attention at the Golden Dragon. "What did you think of the performance?" she asked, turning to face me. "I was so nervous, but I think it went well." "Shalita," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Of course. What is it? How many of those men do you know personally?" She laughed, but it sounded forced, artificial. "What do you mean?" "I don't really know any of them. They're just people who heard about the performance somehow. Word gets around in the expat community, you know." She was lying. I could see it in her eyes, hear it in the slight tremor in her voice. But part of me, the part that had been lonely for so long, that had invested so much emotionally in our relationship, still wanted to believe her. "Mark," she said, stepping closer and placing her hand on my arm, "you seem upset. Did something happen? Did someone say something to you?" The concern in her voice sounded genuine. The way she was looking at me, like she truly cared about my feelings, felt real. For a moment, I wavered, considered backing down, apologizing for my suspicions. But then I remembered the shopping bags, the expensive clothes, the phone calls she would step away to take, the way she'd deflected every attempt I'd made to visit her apartment or meet her friends or become more integrated into her life. "I think," I said slowly, "that I need some time to process tonight." She nodded, but I could see a flicker of something, panic, calculation, cross her features before she composed herself again. "Of course," she said. "It was an emotional performance for me, too. Maybe we should both take a few days, and then we can talk." I agreed, kissed her goodbye like nothing had changed, and took a taxi back to my hotel. But everything had changed. The foundation of what I thought we had been building together had developed cracks that I could no longer ignore. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind churning through every interaction we'd had over the past 3 months, the inconsistencies I dismissed, the stories that didn't quite add up, the way she'd always steered conversations away from certain topics or deflected questions about her past with charm and misdirection. I thought about the other men in that theater. How many of them had helped pay for the costume? How many had been told they were the only one invited to this private performance? How many were lying in their own hotel rooms right now, staring at their own ceilings, wondering what the hell was happening to their lives? By morning, I had made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I owed myself that much. I owed my children, who deserved a father who wasn't a fool, that much. And maybe, just maybe, I owed those other men in the front row that much too. The investigation began with the simplest possible step. I hired a private detective. I found him through a recommendation from one of my work colleagues, a Thai man named Somchai who had worked with foreign businessmen before and spoke excellent English. I met him in a coffee shop near my hotel, feeling ridiculous and melodramatic, but determined to know the truth. "I need to know about someone," I told him, sliding an envelope with Chalita's photo and the basic information I had about her across the table. "I need to know if she's been honest with me." Somchai looked at the photo for a long moment, then back at me with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Foreign man falls in love with Thai woman, begins to suspect something is not right. I nodded, embarrassed by how cliched my situation apparently was. "This happens more than you might think," he said gently. "I will find out what you need to know. But first, let me ask you, are you prepared for the possibility that what you discover will be very different from what you have been told?" I thought about it for a moment. Was I prepared? Could anyone ever really be prepared for the systematic destruction of everything they thought they knew about someone they loved? I need to know, I said. Need to know. Whatever it is, I need to know. While Somchai worked on his investigation, I found myself unable to maintain the facade of normalcy with Chalita. When she called, our conversations felt stilted, artificial. When we met for dinner, I caught myself studying her face for signs of deception instead of simply enjoying her company. She seemed to sense the change in me and became more attentive, more affectionate, as if trying to recapture something that was slipping away. "You've been so quiet lately," she said one evening as we walked along the Chao Phraya River. "Are you having problems at work?" "Just tired," I lied. "The project is more demanding than I expected." She stopped walking and turned to face me, her hands on my arms, her eyes searching my face with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Mark, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Whatever is bothering you, we can work through it together." The sincerity in her voice was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed her. Almost told her about my suspicions, almost gave her the chance to explain everything in a way that would make sense, that would restore my faith in what we had together. But then my phone buzzed with a text message from Somchai. "Meet me tomorrow. I have information." I spent the next 24 hours in a state of barely controlled anxiety. At work, I made mistakes I'd never made before, simple calculations that I'd been doing automatically for 30 years. My colleagues began asking if I was feeling well, if I needed to take some time off. The truth was, I felt like I was coming apart at the seams, like my entire sense of reality was about to be shattered. The meeting with Somchai took place in the same coffee shop where we'd first met. He arrived carrying a manila folder that looked disturbingly thick, and his expression was grim as he sat down across from me. "Before I show you this," he said, "I want you to know that I verified everything multiple times. What I'm about to tell you is accurate." I nodded, gripping my coffee cup so tightly my knuckles went white. "The woman you know as Chalita is actually named Siraporn Watanabe. She is 34 years old, not 28. She works for an organization that targets foreign men, particularly middle-aged divorced or widowed men who are living temporarily in Bangkok." He opened the folder and spread several photographs on the table between us. Pictures of Chalita, Siraporn, with different men. Different outfits, different locations, but the same smile, the same body language, the same intimate expressions I thought she reserved for me alone. "This is Robert Mitchell," Somchai said, pointing to one photo. "Australian businessman, divorced, here for 6 months on a construction project. This is David Klein, German architect, widowed 3-month contract with a hotel development company. This is James Morrison, Canadian software engineer, recently separated from his wife, working for a tech startup in Bangkok." Each name hit me like a physical blow. These were the men from the theater, the men who had sat in that front row with their flowers and their expectations, just like me. "How many?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Currently active?" We identified 14 men she has been seeing regularly over the past 6 months, but based on financial records we were able to access, she has run this same operation with at least 40 different men over the past 2 years. 40 men. 40 men who thought they were special, who thought they were the only one, who had been manipulated and deceived in exactly the same way I had been. "The dance performance," I said. "How many times has she done that?" "Every few months with different groups of men, always the same choreography, always the same venue. She rents the space for the evening and invites whoever is currently in her active rotation. Most of the men never realize they're not the only one invited because she staggers their arrival times and treats each encounter as if it's coincidental. But we all arrived at the same time that night. Yes, that was unusual. Possibly a mistake, or possibly she was growing overconfident in her ability to manage multiple relationships simultaneously. I stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with this systematic predator who had turned emotional manipulation into a profitable enterprise. "The money I gave her," I said. "The rent, the medical bills, the costume. All fabricated. She owns a 2-bedroom condominium in one of Bangkok's most expensive districts, paid for in cash. She drives a BMW, wears designer clothes, and based on her financial records, earns more in a month from her various relationships than most Bangkok residents earn in a year. The room seemed to spin around me. Every conversation we'd had, every moment of intimacy, every declaration of affection, all of it calculated, rehearsed, performed with the same precision as that dance I'd watched her perform for 11 men simultaneously. "There's more," Somchai said gently. "Do you want to hear it?" I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations, but I nodded anyway. "She has done this in other cities as well. Manila, Ho Chi Minh City, Kuala Lumpur, anywhere there is a significant population of foreign businessmen. She typically works the city for 12 to 18 months, then moves on before anyone becomes suspicious enough to investigate. Like I did. Like you did." I paid Somchai his fee and walked out of that coffee shop feeling like a completely different person than the one who had walked in. The Mark Stevenson who had entered that cafe still believed, on some level, that there might be an innocent explanation for what he'd witnessed. The Mark Stevenson who left knew with crushing certainty that he had been the victim of an elaborate long-term con game. The walk back to my hotel seemed to take forever. Bangkok's streets, which had begun to feel familiar and welcoming over the past few months, now felt foreign and menacing again. Every face looked suspicious, every smile seemed calculating, every interaction felt like a potential deception. My phone rang 3 times during that walk. Chalita's name appeared on the screen each time. I let it go to voicemail. Back in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to her messages. Each one was perfectly crafted, expressing just the right amount of concern without seeming desperate or clingy. "Hi, Mark. I haven't heard from you today, and I'm getting a bit worried. Just call me when you get this, okay? Mark, it's me again. I hope everything is all right at work. Maybe we could have dinner tonight. I miss you. I'm starting to worry that something has happened to you. Please call me back. I love you, Mark. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it together. I love you." 3 words she had never said before, deployed now with surgical precision at the exact moment when she sensed I was pulling away. I called her back. "Mark!" Her voice was flooded with relief. "I was so worried about you. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I need to see you tonight. Can you come to my hotel?" "Of course. Is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything's fine. I just need to talk to you about something important. We arranged to meet in an hour. I spent that time deciding how to handle the confrontation, running through different scenarios in my mind. Part of me wanted to present all the evidence dramatically, to watch her face when she realized her game was over. Part of me wanted to give her a chance to explain, to see if there was any possibility that Somchai's investigation had somehow been wrong. But mostly I just wanted to understand how someone could do this to another human being. How someone could look into the eyes of a lonely, vulnerable person and systematically exploit their need for connection and love. When Chalita arrived at my hotel room, she seemed nervous, fidgety in a way I'd never seen before. She was wearing a simple dress and minimal makeup, and there was something about her appearance that seemed more authentic than usual, less carefully constructed. "You wanted to talk about something important," she said, settling into the chair by the window. "Yes." I sat on the edge of the bed, facing her. "I want to talk about Siraporn Watanabe." The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. The mask of concern and affection slipped away, replaced by something hard and calculating. For a moment, we stared at each other in complete silence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, but there was no conviction in her voice. "I think you do," I replied. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Just like you know about Robert Mitchell and David Klein and James Morrison and all the others." She stood up abruptly, moving toward the door. "I don't have to listen to this." "No," I said, not moving from my position on the bed. "You don't. You can leave right now and I'll never contact you again. But if you do that, I'm going to make sure that every one of your current targets knows exactly what kind of game they're playing." She stopped with her hand on the door handle, her back to me. I have photographs, I continued, financial records, a complete investigation report. I know about the condo in Sukhumvit, the BMW, the previous cities. I know all of it, Siraporn. Slowly, she turned around. The woman facing me now was someone I'd never met before, harder, colder, entirely different from the vulnerable, romantic figure I'd fallen in love with. "What do you want?" she asked. The question hung in the air between us. What did I want? Revenge? An apology? Some kind of explanation that would make sense of the past 3 months of my life? "I want to understand," I said. "I want to know how you can do this to people. How you can look someone in the eye and systematically destroy their ability to trust another human being." She laughed, but it was a bitter sound, entirely different from the musical laughter I remembered. "You want to understand? Fine. Sit down and I'll tell you exactly how this works." She moved back to the chair, but her posture was different now, straighter, more controlled, like a businesswoman giving a presentation. "Step 1, she said. Identify the target. Middle-aged foreign men, recently divorced or widowed, working temporarily in Bangkok. Men who are lonely, vulnerable, and desperate for connection. Men who have money but lack the social skills to recognize when they're being manipulated." Each word was like a knife sliding between my ribs. "Step 2, create the perfect woman for each specific target. For you, that meant someone who seemed cultured but not intimidating, exotic but not too foreign, vulnerable enough to need rescuing but independent enough to seem genuine. For David, it was different. He needed someone more intellectual, more challenging. For Robert, someone more submissive, more traditionally feminine. How do you know what each man needs? Research, observation. People tell you everything about themselves if you know how to ask the right questions. That first night at the karaoke bar, you told me your entire life story within an hour. Your failed marriage, your difficult relationship with your children, your sense of isolation and displacement. You handed me a blueprint for exactly how to manipulate you. The clinical way she was describing our relationship was almost more devastating than the deception itself. Step 3, create artificial intimacy through shared vulnerability. I tell you about my tragic backstory. Dead parents, no family, financial struggles. This serves two purposes. It makes you feel protective of me, and it provides justification for the financial assistance that will come later. The money I gave you was never for what I said it was for. The rent money went into my investment portfolio, the dental work I never needed, the medical bills were fabricated. Everything I told you about my financial situation was designed to extract money from you in amounts small enough that you wouldn't question them. And the other men? They were giving you money too? Of course. Different amounts, different justifications, but yes. Robert was helping me save up to visit my sick grandmother in the countryside. David was contributing to my evening English classes. James thought he was helping me start a small business selling handmade jewelry. I felt sick, not just emotionally, but physically, like my body was rejecting the reality of what I was hearing. Step 4, maintain multiple relationships simultaneously while making each man feel like he's the only one. This requires careful scheduling, detailed record keeping, and the ability to completely change your personality depending on which role you're playing on any given day. How many relationships can you manage at once? My record is 18. That was in Manila, but 15 to 20 is optimal. Any more than that, and you start making mistakes, like what happened at the dance performance. Any fewer, and the income isn't sufficient to justify the time investment. She was talking about human beings, about me, like we were portfolio investments or business opportunities. Step 5, periodic grand gestures to reinforce emotional attachment. The dance performance serves this purpose. It makes each man feel special, chosen, like he's being given access to something private and meaningful. The fact that multiple men attend the same performance is irrelevant as long as each one believes he's the only one who truly matters to me. But we all saw each other there. Usually that's managed better. Different seating areas, staggered arrival times, careful choreography to make eye contact with each man individually. That night was an anomaly. What went wrong? For the first time since she'd started her explanation, her composure cracked slightly. I got careless, overconfident. I'd been running this operation successfully for over 2 years without anyone becoming suspicious enough to investigate. I thought I could push the boundaries a little. And step 6? There isn't one. This continues indefinitely until either the man's assignment in Bangkok ends naturally, or he becomes suspicious and needs to be managed or abandoned. Managed how? Her expression became even colder. Gaslighting, making him question his own perceptions, emotional manipulation designed to make him feel guilty for doubting me. In extreme cases, threats. What kind of threats? Claims of harassment, fabricated evidence of stalking. Immigration authorities can be very responsive when a local woman claims she's being pursued inappropriately by a foreign man. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. This wasn't some opportunistic scam. It was a carefully orchestrated long-term business plan designed to systematically exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of men like me. How long have you been doing this? I asked. 5 years, started small with just 1 or 2 men at a time, but I got better at it, more efficient, developed systems, refined the process. Now it's my career. Don't you feel anything for any of us? Any guilt, any empathy? She considered the question for a moment, and I found myself hoping for some sign of humanity, some indication that the woman I'd fallen in love with existed somewhere beneath this cold, calculating persona. At first, maybe, she said. The first few men, I felt a little bad about what I was doing. But you get numb to it after a while. And besides, most of you are better off afterward. Better off? How can you possibly say that? You learn not to be so naive, so trusting, so easily manipulated. I provide a valuable service, really. I teach you lessons about the real world that you clearly needed to learn. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. Besides, she continued, it's not like any of you were actually in love with me. You were in love with an idea, a fantasy, a projection of what you wanted in a woman. I just happened to be skilled at embodying that fantasy. That's not true, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if she might be right. Had I been in love with Chelita, or had I been in love with the idea of not being alone anymore? Isn't it? She asked. You knew nothing about my real life, my real interests, my real personality. You fell in love with the character I was playing, not with me. She stood up again, smoothing down her dress. I assume this is where you threaten to expose me to the other men? I haven't decided yet, I said honestly. Well, when you do decide, consider this. Most of them won't thank you. Most of them will prefer to live with the illusion rather than face the reality, and the few who do believe you will just move on to the next woman willing to tell them what they want to hear. She moved toward the door again, then paused. For what it's worth, Mark, you were one of the better ones. Kinder than most, more generous, less demanding. If I were capable of feeling affection for any of my targets, it probably would have been you. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in my hotel room with the wreckage of everything I'd believed about love, trust, and human connection. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through every moment of our relationship, re-examining each interaction through the lens of what I now knew. The careful way she'd drawn my story out of me that first night, the perfectly timed financial crises, the way she'd deflected my attempts to become more involved in her life, the consistency with which she'd made me feel like I was the one pursuing her rather than the other way around. It was masterfully done, I had to admit, a work of art in its own twisted way. But understanding the mechanics of how I'd been manipulated didn't make the emotional impact any less devastating. I had opened my heart to someone who had seen that vulnerability as nothing more than a business opportunity. I had shared my deepest fears, my most private thoughts, my hope for a future with someone, with a person who was simultaneously having identical conversations with dozens of other men. The loneliness I'd felt after my divorce seemed quaint compared to this. That had been the loneliness of loss, of something real coming to an end. This was the loneliness of discovering that something I'd thought was real had never existed at all. Around 4 in the morning, I made a decision. I was going to find the other men. I started with the ones I'd seen at the theater performance using the information Somchai had provided. Robert Mitchell, the Australian businessman, was staying at a hotel about 2 kilometers from mine. I called him the next morning. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Mark Stevenson. I believe we met briefly at a dance performance earlier this week." There was a long pause. "Yes, I remember. Is there something I can help you with?" "I think there's something you need to know about the woman who invited you to that performance." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean. Could we meet somewhere private? I have information I think you'll want to see." We agreed to meet at a coffee shop neutral to both of us. Robert arrived looking suspicious and slightly defensive, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his early 60s with gray hair and the kind of tan that comes from years of outdoor work. "Before we start," he said as he sat down across from me, "I want you to know that if this is some kind of jealousy thing, if you're here to warn me away from Chalida because you think you have some kind of claim on her, you're wasting both our time." I spread Somchai's photographs on the table between us. Robert's expression changed as he recognized himself in several of the images, then Chalida with other men in similar poses, similar settings. "Her real name is Siraporn Watanabe," I said gently. "She's been running this operation for years." I told him everything I'd learned, showed him all the evidence, explained the systematic way we'd both been targeted and manipulated. Robert listened in stunned silence, occasionally picking up one of the photographs to examine it more closely. "The grandmother in the countryside," he said finally, "the one I've been helping her save money to visit, doesn't exist. The traditional dance lessons she's been taking, she's been performing professionally for years. The financial problems, the family obligations, all fabricated." Robert sat back in his chair, his face pale. "How many others? Active right now?" "At least 14 that we've identified." "And I'm just one of 14? "I'm afraid so." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what we discovered. "What are you going to do?" Robert asked finally. "I'm going to tell all of them. Every man I can identify. They have a right to know. Some of them won't believe you." "I know, but I have to try." Robert nodded slowly. "I'll help. Give me the list." Over the next 2 weeks, Robert and I became unlikely partners in a campaign to expose Siraporn's operation. We contacted every man we could identify, meeting them in coffee shops and hotel lobbies, presenting evidence and explaining what we discovered. The reactions varied dramatically. Some men, like James Morrison, the Canadian software engineer, accepted the truth immediately and thanked us for the information. Others, like David Klein, the German architect, became angry and defensive, accusing us of lying out of jealousy or spite. A few simply refused to meet with us at all. The most difficult conversation was with a man named Peter Williams, a recent widower from New Zealand whose wife had died of cancer just 6 months earlier. He was older than the rest of us, maybe 70, and when we showed him the evidence of Siraporn's deception, he began to cry. "She was the first person who made me feel alive again after Margaret died," he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I know you're telling the truth. I can see it in these photographs, but she was the first person who made me feel like I might be able to be happy again." That conversation haunted me for weeks afterward. The realization that Siraporn's victims weren't just losing money or pride, they were losing hope, faith in the possibility of human connection, the belief that love was still possible in their lives. By the end of those 2 weeks, we'd successfully contacted 11 of the 14 men we'd identified. Of those 11, 8 believed us and ended their relationships with Siraporn. 3 refused to accept what we were telling them and continued seeing her despite the evidence. I never heard from Siraporn directly after our final conversation in my hotel room, but according to the men who were still seeing her, she had explanations for everything. We were disgruntled former boyfriends seeking revenge. The photographs were doctored. The financial records were fabricated. The private investigator was part of an elaborate scheme to break up her relationships with men who truly cared about her. Some of the men believed these explanations. Love, I learned, can make people believe almost anything if the alternative is too painful to accept. A week after our exposure campaign began, I received a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Stevenson," the voice was official, crisp, speaking English with a Thai accent. "This is Officer Naran from Bangkok Metropolitan Police. We need to speak with you about a harassment complaint that has been filed against you." My blood went cold. "I'm sorry, what?" "A local woman has filed a formal complaint stating that you have been stalking and harassing her. She claims you have been following her, taking photographs without permission, and making threats against her safety. We need you to come to the station for questioning." I knew immediately what was happening. This was Siraporn's retaliation, the management she had mentioned during our final conversation. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any less terrifying. "When do you need me to come in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "This afternoon would be best." 2 o'clock. I spent the hours before the meeting frantically calling Robert and James Morrison, the two men who had been most supportive of our efforts to expose Siraporn. I explained what was happening, shared copies of all the evidence we'd gathered, and asked them to serve as witnesses if needed. "This is exactly what she threatened," Robert said grimly. "She's trying to silence you before you can warn anyone else." The police station was a busy, chaotic place filled with the sounds of ringing phones, overlapping conversations, and the constant shuffle of paperwork. Officer Naran was a small, serious-looking man in his 40s who led me to a cramped interview room and gestured for me to sit across from him at a metal table. "Tell me about your relationship with Miss Siraporn Watanabe," he said, opening a folder filled with what appeared to be photographs and documents. "We dated for approximately 3 months," I said carefully. "The relationship ended when I discovered she was simultaneously dating multiple other men and had been deceiving me about various aspects of her life." "And after the relationship ended, did you attempt to contact her?" "Yes, once. We met at my hotel to discuss what I had discovered." "Did you threaten her during this meeting?" "No. I told her I was considering informing the other men she was deceiving, but I made no threats." Officer Naran pulled out several photographs and spread them on the table. They showed me at various locations around Bangkok, outside the coffee shop where Robert and I had met, near the hotel where David Klein was staying, walking down streets in areas where some of the other men lived. "Miss Watanabe claims you have been following her, taking photographs of her activities, and stalking her in an attempt to interfere with her personal relationships." I stared at the photographs in amazement. They were clearly surveillance photos, taken with a telephoto lens from considerable distances. But they had been carefully selected and cropped to make it appear as though I was conducting some kind of stalking campaign. "Officer Naran," I said, "I was meeting with other men who had been deceived by Ms. Watanabe in the same way I was. I have documentation proving that she has been running an elaborate fraud operation targeting foreign businessmen." "Do you have this documentation with you?" I pulled out copies of Somchai's investigation report, the financial records, the photographs showing Siraporn with multiple men. Officer Naran examined them carefully, his expression becoming increasingly thoughtful. "These are quite detailed," he said. "Where did you obtain this information?" "I hired a private investigator. Everything has been verified multiple times." "And you shared this information with other men?" "Yes, men who were being deceived in the same way I was. They had a right to know." Officer Naran leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "Mr. Stevenson, what Miss Watanabe is doing may be morally questionable, but it is not necessarily illegal under Thai law. If these men gave her money willingly, if they entered into relationships with her of their own free choice, then no crime has been committed. But the deception, the systematic fraud. Proving fraud requires demonstrating that she obtained money under false pretenses with criminal intent. Based on what you've shown me, she received gifts from men who were romantically interested in her. The fact that she was not exclusive with any of you does not make those gifts fraudulent. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Siraporn had been careful to operate within legal boundaries. She had never directly solicited money, never made explicit promises she could be held accountable for, never put anything in writing that could be used as evidence of criminal intent. However, Officer Naran continued, the complaint against you is also problematic. These photographs clearly show you conducting surveillance activities, but they appear to be part of a legitimate investigation into someone who has deceived you. I am inclined to dismiss the harassment charges if you agree to cease all contact with Ms. Watanabe and stop attempting to interfere with her relationships. It was a draw, essentially. Neither of us had enough evidence to pursue serious legal action against the other, but both of us would be forced to back down. I agree to those terms, I said. Good. I will inform Ms. Watanabe that the charges are being dismissed, but that any further contact from you will result in immediate arrest. I suggest you focus on your work project and avoid any further involvement in this situation. I left the police station feeling both relieved and frustrated. Relieved that I wasn't going to be arrested or deported, but frustrated that Siraporn would face no consequences for what she had done to me and dozens of other men. That evening, I called Robert to update him on what had happened. So she gets away with it? He asked. Legally, yes. But we managed to warn 8 men before this happened. 8 men who won't be sending her money anymore, who won't be believing her lies anymore. That's something. What about the others? The ones who didn't believe us? There's nothing more we can do for them. They'll have to figure it out on their own. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation or satisfying resolution I'd hoped for, but it was real life. Real life is messier, more complicated, more ambiguous than the stories we tell ourselves about justice and consequences. Over the following weeks, I threw myself back into my work with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. The construction project became my refuge, a place where problems had concrete solutions and progress could be measured in tangible results. Steel beams were erected on schedule, concrete was poured according to specifications, electrical systems were installed precisely as designed. It was orderly, predictable, honest work, everything my relationship with Siraporn had not been. But the emotional recovery was much more difficult than the professional one. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about human nature, about love, about my own judgment. How had I been so completely deceived? What was it about me that had made me such an easy target? How could I ever trust my own instincts about people again? The worst part wasn't the financial loss. The money I'd given Siraporn was significant but not devastating. The worst part was the complete erosion of my confidence in my ability to recognize authentic human connection. If I could be so thoroughly manipulated by someone I'd spent months with, someone I'd shared my deepest thoughts and feelings with, how could I ever trust my judgment about anyone again? I started seeing a therapist who specialized in working with expatriate professionals. Dr. Sarah Chen was a British psychologist who had been practicing in Bangkok for over a decade, and she had extensive experience with the kind of emotional trauma I was dealing with. What you experienced wasn't just romantic deception, she explained during one of our early sessions. It was a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that exploited very specific vulnerabilities you had at a very specific time in your life. But how did I not see it? How did I not realize what was happening? Because she was exceptionally skilled at what she did, and because you were in a psychological state that made you particularly susceptible to this kind of manipulation. You were recently divorced, isolated from your support network, living in an unfamiliar culture, dealing with significant loneliness and self-doubt. Those conditions create the perfect storm for this kind of victimization. Dr. Chen helped me understand that what had happened to me wasn't a reflection of some fundamental weakness or stupidity on my part. It was the result of a predator who had systematically identified and exploited my psychological vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon. The goal now, she said, is not to become cynical or closed off from human connection, but to develop better boundaries, better awareness of red flags, and most importantly, a stronger sense of your own worth that doesn't depend on external validation. The therapy sessions became the most important part of my week. Slowly, gradually, I began to rebuild my sense of self-worth, to separate my identity from the shame and humiliation of having been deceived. I learned to recognize the difference between healthy romantic vulnerability and the kind of desperate need for validation that had made me such an easy target. I also began to understand something else. The Mark Stevenson who had walked into that karaoke lounge 6 months earlier had been a broken man, someone so starved for affection and connection that he would have been vulnerable to any skilled manipulator who offered him what he thought he needed. The man I was becoming through therapy and self-reflection was stronger, more self-aware, more complete on his own. It was painful growth, but it was real growth. My work project in Bangkok was scheduled to end in 2 more months, and I found myself looking forward to returning to Manchester with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I was eager to reconnect with my children, to rebuild relationships that had suffered during my marriage and divorce, but I was also nervous about returning to a life that had felt so empty and purposeless before I'd come to Thailand. "Home will be different now because you're different now, Doctor," Chen said during one of our final sessions. "You're not the same man who left Manchester 8 months ago." She was right. The man who had left Manchester had been defined primarily by his failures. His failed marriage, his difficult relationship with his children, his sense of professional stagnation. The man who would be returning had experienced something terrible, but he had also survived it, learned from it, and grown stronger because of it. 3 weeks before my scheduled departure, I received an unexpected phone call from James Morrison, the Canadian software engineer who had helped us expose Siraporn's operation. "Mark," he said, "I thought you should know. Siraporn has left Bangkok." "Left? Where did she go?" "Nobody knows for sure, but word is she's moved to Singapore. Apparently our little exposure campaign made Bangkok too hot for her to operate effectively." I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing this news. Relief that she couldn't hurt any more men in Bangkok. Satisfaction that our efforts had accomplished something meaningful. But also a kind of sadness that she would simply move to another city and begin the same operation with new victims who had no idea what they were walking into. Did the other men, the ones who didn't believe us initially, did any of them figure it out? 2 of them did eventually. Peter Williams, the widower from New Zealand, finally admitted that the story she was telling him didn't add up. And David Klein came around when she asked him for a large sum of money to help with a family emergency that he was able to verify never happened. What about the third one? Still seeing her as far as I know. Or was until she left town. Some people, I realized, would rather live with a beautiful lie than face an ugly truth. And maybe that was their choice to make. As my time in Bangkok drew to a close, I found myself taking long walks through the city, revisiting places that had been significant during my relationship with Siraporn, but seeing them now with completely different eyes. The karaoke lounge where we'd met looked smaller, seedier, less magical than it had that first night. The restaurants where we'd shared intimate dinners seemed ordinary, unremarkable, like stage sets where performances had taken place rather than venues for genuine human connection. But I also discovered new places, parts of Bangkok I'd never explored during my months of obsessive focus on Siraporn. I visited temples and museums, tried street foods I'd been too nervous to sample before, had conversations with locals who had nothing to gain from talking to me except the simple pleasure of human interaction. Bangkok, I realized, was a beautiful, complex, vibrant city that deserved to be experienced on its own terms rather than through the filter of romantic delusion. On my last night in Thailand, I returned to the Golden Dragon karaoke lounge where everything had started. I ordered the same beer I'd been drinking that first night, sat at the same table where I'd been sitting when Shalita, Siraporn, had first approached me. But instead of dwelling on what had happened there, I found myself thinking about what I'd learned, about the man I'd become, about the future I was building for myself. The loneliness that had driven me into that relationship was still there, but it was different now, less desperate, less defining, more like a temporary condition rather than a permanent state of being. I thought about the other men who had been caught in Siriporn's web, wondered how they were processing their experiences, whether they were finding ways to grow from what had happened to them, or whether they were allowing it to make them bitter and closed off from future possibilities. And I thought about Siriporn herself, somewhere in Singapore now, probably sitting in another karaoke lounge or coffee shop, identifying her next target, crafting her next performance, preparing to systematically dismantle another lonely man's capacity for trust and love. Part of me felt sorry for her. What kind of life was that, really? What kind of person could sustain that level of constant deception, that complete absence of genuine human connection? In some ways, she was more trapped than any of us had been, trapped in a prison of her own making, unable to experience real intimacy or authentic relationships. But mostly I felt grateful for Dr. Chen's guidance, grateful for Robert's friendship, grateful for my own resilience, grateful for the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving something that could have destroyed you. Now, here's something I want to ask all of you watching this. Have you ever known anyone who went through something similar? Maybe not exactly the same situation, but someone who was systematically deceived by a person they trusted and loved. How did they handle it? How did they recover? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, because these stories of deception and recovery are more common than we like to admit, and hearing from others who have walked similar paths can be incredibly healing. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this need to be told and heard. The flight back to Manchester was long and reflective. As the airplane lifted off from Bangkok's airport and Thailand disappeared beneath the clouds, I felt like I was leaving behind not just a country, but an entire chapter of my life. The man who was returning to England was fundamentally different from the one who had left 8 months earlier. I had learned that loneliness, while painful, was not an emergency that required immediate fixing at any cost. I had learned that authentic human connection was worth waiting for, worth being patient for, worth developing the emotional intelligence and self-awareness necessary to recognize when it was real. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth as a human being was not dependent on whether someone else loved me or wanted to be with me. The desperate need for external validation that had made me such easy prey for someone like Siriporn had been replaced by a more solid, self-generated sense of identity and purpose. My children met me at Manchester Airport. Emma, my daughter, now 25 and working as a teacher in London, and Michael, my son, 23 and finishing his master's degree in computer science. They looked older, more mature than when I'd left, and I realized that my time away had given all of us space to grow and change. "You look different, Dad," Emma said as we drove through the familiar streets of Manchester. More settled somehow. She was right. The restless anxiety that had characterized my life for years after the divorce was gone, replaced by something calmer, more purposeful. Over dinner that first night back, I found myself talking to my children in a way I hadn't been able to before. Not about the specifics of what had happened in Bangkok. That story was too raw, too complicated for a homecoming dinner, but about the broader lessons I'd learned about resilience, about self-worth, about the importance of authentic relationships over convenient ones. I made some mistakes while I was away, I told them, but I learned from them. And one of the things I learned is that I want to rebuild our relationships, to be the kind of father and grandfather you deserve, rather than the bitter, disappointed man I was becoming after the divorce. The conversation that followed was the most honest, most emotionally open discussion we'd had in years. Both Emma and Michael shared their own struggles, their own disappointments, their own efforts to build meaningful lives in a world that often felt superficial and disconnected. "We all make mistakes, Dad," Michael said at one point. "The important thing is what we do with them afterward." Returning to work in Manchester was easier than I'd expected. The company was pleased with my performance on the Bangkok project, and there were new opportunities available. Projects that would challenge me professionally without requiring extended time away from the relationships I was working to rebuild. I also began dating again, but with a completely different approach than I'd ever taken before. Instead of desperately seeking someone to fill the emptiness in my life, I focused on becoming the kind of person who could contribute to a healthy, balanced relationship. I worked on my interests, my friendships, my relationship with my children. I continued therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to keep growing. When I did meet someone I was interested in, Sarah, a fellow engineer who worked for a consulting firm in Manchester, I took things slowly. I paid attention to consistency between her words and actions. I looked for signs of genuine character rather than just chemistry or surface compatibility. I shared my own vulnerabilities gradually, appropriately, in the context of growing mutual trust rather than as a way to fast-track intimacy. Most importantly, I never forgot the lesson that Siriporn had taught me, albeit unintentionally, that real love is built on truth, not fantasy. It develops slowly through shared experiences and genuine understanding. It doesn't require you to rescue anyone or be rescued by anyone. It doesn't involve dramatic gestures or elaborate performances. Real love, I learned, is actually quite ordinary most of the time. It's consistent, reliable, authentic. It's built on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than desperate need or calculated manipulation. Sarah and I have been together for 18 months now, and while I can't predict the future, I can say with confidence that what we have is real. Built on truth, honesty, and mutual respect rather than fantasy and desperation. I still think about Bangkok sometimes, about the man I was when I arrived there and the man I became during my time there. I think about Robert, who stayed in touch for several months after we both returned to our home countries, and about the other men who were caught in Siriporn's web. I hope they've found their own paths to healing and growth. I even think about Siriporn sometimes, wondering whether she's still running the same operation in Singapore or whether she's moved on to yet another city, another group of vulnerable men who have no idea what they're walking into. But mostly I think about the future, about the relationships I'm building with my children and grandchildren, about the work I'm doing that feels meaningful and challenging, about the possibility that the best chapters of my life might still be ahead of me rather than behind me. The story I've told you today isn't really about romance or deception or even Bangkok, though it includes all of those things. It's about resilience. It's about the human capacity to survive devastating betrayal and emerge stronger, wiser, more compassionate. It's about the difference between being a victim of circumstances and being someone who learns from difficult experiences and uses them as fuel for growth. If you're watching this and you've experienced something similar, whether it was romantic deception, financial fraud, or any other kind of systematic manipulation, I want you to know that what happened to you doesn't define who you are. The shame and humiliation you might be feeling are temporary, even though they don't feel temporary right now. You can recover from this. You can rebuild your capacity for trust without becoming naive. You can learn to recognize red flags without becoming cynical. You can develop the kind of healthy boundaries that protect you from predators while still allowing authentic people into your life. But it takes work. It takes time. It takes a willingness to examine your own vulnerabilities honestly, not to blame yourself for what happened, but to understand how to protect yourself better in the future. Most importantly, it takes a commitment to your own worth and dignity that doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion or validation. The loneliness that made me vulnerable to someone like Siriporn was real, but it was also temporary. The connections I've built since then, with my children, with Sarah, with friends and colleagues who value authenticity over performance, are also real, and they're lasting in ways that fantasy relationships never can be. If I could go back and prevent what happened in Bangkok, I'm not sure I would. The experience was devastating, humiliating, and painful in ways I hope I never have to experience again. But it also taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. It forced me to grow in directions I wouldn't have chosen but desperately needed. The Mark Stevenson who returned from Bangkok was a better man than the one who had left Manchester, stronger, wiser, more self-aware, more capable of genuine love and authentic relationship. That transformation came at a high price, but it was worth it. And if my story can help even one person recognize the signs of manipulation before they fall victim to it, or recover more quickly if they already have, then sharing these painful details will have served a purpose beyond my own healing. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to share something so personal, so difficult, so important. I hope it helps you in some way, whether you needed to hear it for yourself or for someone you care about. And please, before you go, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment sharing your thoughts about what you've heard today. These conversations matter. These stories matter. And your engagement helps ensure that other people who need to hear messages like this will have the opportunity to find them. Keep watching for more stories, more lessons, more reminders that no matter what you've been through, no matter how badly you've been hurt, recovery is possible, growth is possible, love, real love is possible. The best chapters of your story are still being